revolution, right? In our world kind of faces the atrocities of historic and systemic racism. It's a reckoning. It's a reckoning that's been brewing for centuries because of the enslavement of people that look like me. And so now more than ever, our voices must be heard. Your voice must be heard. And now more than ever, data and measurable change has to be a part of that conversation. And so for the next 30 seconds, I'd like to hold space in silence, right? And so when we begin this 30 seconds, what I'd like you to do is hold space for those that are still out on the front lines marching for humanity. I'd like you to hold just 30 seconds of space for Black people across the world and the diaspora who are hurting and suffering disproportionately due to COVID-19. I'd like you to remember all of those Black men and women and children locked away in a system of mass incarceration. I'd like you to think a little bit about the Black girls, us Black girls, who by the age of 5 years old are looked at as less innocent, as needing less comfort or needing less love, as more culpable. Please, with me, wherever you are, take a deep breath, let it out, and let's hold space. I'll let you know when we're ready. I hope that felt like the longest 30 seconds of your life, because our lives are all going to change very soon. Now let's get to work. So today you'll learn about the research showing that racial bias and how it influences children of color who are treated in the juvenile justice system. You're going to hear from a panel of experts and directly impacted Black women about the experiences they have faced in the juvenile justice system. You're going to receive concrete tools for integrating this research into practice so that you can raise race successfully on behalf of juvenile clients. To follow up, you will receive some materials from Lone Star Justice Alliance to enhance your practice, and hopefully you'll choose to share those materials. Now, allow me to introduce our first training expert. Cameron Johnson has been practicing juvenile and criminal defense for over 25 years. He's the longest serving chief public defender in the state of Texas. Cameron has been serving as the juvenile public defender in Travis County since January of 2001. With an office of 11 public defenders, and I know that many of them are today watching. And they are the longest, most experienced collection of juvenile lawyers, according to Cameron, of course. So Cameron, please take it away.
Good morning again, everybody. Listen, I want to begin by saying, Mimi, thank you so much for allowing me to be able to share your space with you and to being able to touch so many people. For my, attorneys out there, I didn't realize so many of us had birthdays in June. and we're trying to get this CLE credit. But I am really, really happy to be here. Elizabeth, Lone Star Justice is something we've been talking about for a while, and it's never been so more timely. And so I want to thank you, for being here with me, and you, Dr. Butler. Thank you for being part, of this. And I'm excited and really wanted to, looking forward to hearing the presentation and being able to share, with everyone. What I was thinking when we talk about this being timely, as Mimi said, that I've been in this doing juvenile justice for over 25 years. And what I've seen in the 25 years is I've seen sort of, we've had an evolution of what we've done in the juvenile justice community. When I say an evolution, we've had things that when we saw that there were problems, back in the 60s and 70s, we went and we actually did something here. Then in the 70s, I remember about 100, we were celebrating not too many years ago, 100 years of the introduction of juvenile courts. I remember a few years ago, we were celebrating the 50-year anniversary of, Henry Galt. We've just, a few years ago, we had a 10-year anniversary of the Texas Juvenile Justice Committee. What I want to do is to being able to talk about what we are here for. And if I can, let's see if I can pull this up and share my screen. If you can give me one moment. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the implicit and the racial bias. And I thought about exactly what I was going to talk about today, but I want to have some quick goals. We're going to identify and discuss implicit bias, talk about racism and adultification bias. And as Mimi said, Elizabeth, we're also going to be able to give some tools about how we need to bring this into court and being able to do this. So what group norms do we want to talk about? What do we have today? One thing it's going to be is that I know that, you've invited me and invited us, into your homes, into your offices, whether or not you're in your car, is that we're going to have for at least about these 2.5 hours or so, we're going to have this going to be a safe place. So I'm going to tell you about some things that I'm not going to do. But I want to give you a warning that the images that you are going to see are going to be graphic. Do not look away. And I want you to breathe. $5,228. That's the number of youth in Texas who came into the juvenile justice system. Of those 53,000 children, 82% of them were detained in our system at least once. 34% were placed in a residential placement at least one time. And who are these children? And why did they come into our system? Very quickly, the youth we detained, 51% of them had misdemeanor offenses, 15% had probation violations, and 7% had status offenses. So what that means is that if my math is correct, that 73, almost 3/4 of the children that we have were in there for misdemeanor, probation violations, or low-level offenses. 27% were there for felony offenses. You know, in preparing this presentation, I started off by doing a Google search. And when I did my Google search, you know, which is something that I always do when I'm doing presentations, is, you know, I Googled in young teens, and I want everyone else to be able to do that. And these are the images that came up. It was hundreds of images like this. And then I did a Google for young juveniles. And these are the images that I came up. And there were many like this. And this is what we see in our court system. 72% of the youths that we have in our system are male. 49% are Hispanic. 26% African American. Now, that leaves 24%. So 1 in 4 youth who are coming in our system in Texas are white. But that does not speak in and of itself exactly what we're talking about. Because, for example, in Texas and pretty much nationwide, about 12% of our juvenile population in Texas and across the country, they are Black. Hispanic make up about 40% of the juvenile population in Texas, while whites make up 42%. So what is that telling us is like, look, I'm going to just run through some of these numbers because they're very, very important. All right, we're talking about who we're detaining and what is happening once they get into our doors. That we are, you know, Black youth are being detained at a rate of 6 to 1. 6 to 1 based over their population. Latinos 2 to 1. And that is startling because what are we doing? What happens when we talk about commitments? We're talking about to our juvenile justice and our state schools, you know, Texas Juvenile Justice Department. All right. When we look at the youth, who we have there, we're talking about on average is disproportionately, all right, 4 times as many Black youth based upon their representation are actually committed. 4 times. How do we get there? Well, we've also done, and we've continued to do a lot of studies. Now, we think back on that Google search that I did, and we're talking about what is the face of our young population? What is the face of our children? What is the face, and what do we see when we walk into that court? What have we known is this. There have been numerous studies, and we're talking about the type of offenses and the type of things that youth engaged in. And what we see and what we've done is that when we're talking about, I want to call it foolish and impulsive behavior, that there's really no difference based upon the race. In fact, continue to do another Google search and just look at things that our youth are doing. You know, I just recently got introduced to TikTok, and I was like, wow, this is something. But think about it is that the face that we see when we walk into our juvenile courts? What do we know when we're talking about, you know, some of the delinquent behavior or some of the behavior that ends up having youth in juvenile court? What do we know is also sort of like white kids. They're more likely to engage in, you know, excessive drinking, binge behavior. They are more likely to actually have, you know, weapons, carry guns in schools. No. When we get into court, do we hear this information? And this is what we're going to be talking about. And this is the reasons why we're actually doing this presentation is, it's implicit in racial bias. Why is this important? Why is this important? Well, it's because how people are perceived determines exactly how they are going to be treated. All right. So, you know, for example, I was just looking at some of the studies like here in Austin, Texas, where they did a profile of the actual people who were stopped based on race. And, you know, it was startling. What did we learn is that people of color are more likely to be stopped. even though they represent a smaller population. Now, I heard Warren Buffett say something one time, and he said that, if you follow somebody for 500 miles, then you're going to find something wrong. But is that what we're doing? Some of the other studies have pointed out is that when we're talking about the behavior of our youth, is that particularly when we're talking about Black individuals, they seem to be more aggressive and consistent with violent intentions, while they can interpret the same behavior by white individuals as harmless. We've recently listened and heard people talk about the talks that people had to give. Why do we have to be able to give that? Well, it's because of the perceptions of hostility and things of that nature. A lot of studies have also shown it's sort of like when we're looking and we are recognizing, how people are perceived. It's sort of like, this is a study is that it's a very, very brief movie clip when it talks about looking at the faces of Black men, Black people versus those people of white people. And what you've done is that you can see, on this continuum that we have, that there's a change in the faces from hostile to friendly. What we recognize and what we're seeing is that the numbers tell us that people are more perceived to be hostile at earlier ages when there's a Black face as compared to when there's a white face. Wow. We know this, we've seen this. And one of the things that I said I'm not going to do is that I am not going to be calling anybody racist, but I wanted to be able to have this safe environment so that we can talk about the perceptions, because that's what implicit bias is, because we all have them, because they're based upon stereotypes and they're based upon our perceptions. What do we see when we're going into court? What do we see? Weapons. Participants have a tendency to see in these studies that an object that is more likely to be a weapon if it's associated with someone of color. Does that sound familiar? And that also includes children. Think about what happened with Tamir Rice. I listened to, the 911 call, and the caller called in to 911 and said that there is, someone walking around with a gun, and it's probably a toy. Now, did that information get or how it was perceived? If we look at some of these studies and what they've shown us is that it's more likely, even in children, that a toy or a gun is going to be received or interpreted based upon the individual's race, even in young children. Do we want to know? It's sort of like, how do we have a situation when we have a 12-year-old with a toy gun is shot, and 12-year-old, and then we were saying that, hey, we thought he was older. He looked to be about 20 years old. This is also true for all of us. When we're talking about Black children, they look older to all of us. How is that important? When we come into court and we're having the people in there and we look at their age and we study it, the first thing that tells me is that's how long they've been on the earth. But, do we treat 10-year-olds different than when we treat someone who's 14? Or do we treat a 14-year-old different than someone who's 16? Right? If the perception is, and what we view is by the public, that particularly when we're looking at Black children, is that they look to be almost 4.5 years older than they are. And that's even as early as 10 years old. And the police see the same thing. It's actually even greater, almost 4.6 years older than what they actually are. Remember, we're talking about our children. How does this happen? We've broken it down into different groups. We're looking at groups, and let's just say at the age in group 1 was 0 to 4, age in group 2, 5 to 9, age in group 3, 10 to 14. And look and see exactly how all the way over the spectrum is that youth are actually look older, and they're perceived to be older depending upon their color. What do we see? and then we treat them differently, and we bring those things with us in the court. That's why we can have situations where, we've seen the graphics of, 6-year-olds, youngs being arrested at school and are arrested in kindergarten and handcuffed, and placed in the back of a police car. Imagine, just think about the trauma that would happen. Just think about it if you were from the child's view, but also think about it from the family's view. What are they seeing? What is going out? Now, I think most, not just Americans, but most people of all the world were horrified by some of the pictures that we saw, and the death of George Floyd. But what was it? That wasn't the first time that someone of color was killed by the police, but it was the way and the images that what we saw and what was happening. What we need to do is we need to continue this conversation, and we need to be able to talk about it because it matters on what we're doing and where we are and how that we proceed. It's so important because we walk into our courtrooms, and one thing that we don't talk about is we don't talk about race, or we don't talk about color, except when we talk about the reasons why that they were stopped. How many times of those of you who have investigated cases and the reason for the stop was, well, they look to be suspicious. They look to be suspicious. Well, he looked like he was making movements. He was making movements and it was being threatening. I thought he had a gun. I thought that he was having a weapon. I'm not calling, police racist, but what happens when we get into court? And I want you to think about the type of situation is that, let's say if we have a 12-year-old white girl in our courtroom, when we are doing an investigation or we're doing information about that, do we stop and say, hey, what gang are you in? Do we ask that same question to, let's say, that 14 or a 15-year-old? And then what are the responses? When we see that child in either, let's just say, a red shirt, red shoelaces, what do we think? Do we automatically, as our first thoughts, that, hey, he's representing his school colors, or do we represent, we're thinking about certain words that really bring up, these images, gangs. We talk about drugs and we talk about things, we ask all of us, but when we hear those responses, are we able to do things and separate and recognize that, hey, if this is a Black child compared to this is a white child, or do we say, or do we believe that, yes, maybe we need to be able to take a breath and being able to see and being able to judge people without the prism of the stereotypes that we have. And so what I want to do now is I want us to think about that. So when we have that youth come in there, that child come into our courtroom, that child who's been arrested, that child who is being there, recognizing and starting from the point that, I don't want to say that we have a blank slate, I'm saying just the opposite. Recognizing what we see and let's talk about what we see, and so that it doesn't cloud our judgment on what we need to be doing, because it's so important how we represent them. Because if we believe that people are like us, or our children are like us, or that can be our child, then that's how we need to be able to providing them services. What we've done, is that we've changed. As I said, we've had an evolution of where we are. What we've done is that we've gone to be more criminal. And I will say to you is that when we see people as threats, we're more likely to respond with more criminalization. We're more likely to respond with incarceration. We're more likely to remove them from the home. You know, that's how we can have this, is that 82% of the youth that come into our juvenile justice system at one point have been detained. Over a third of them have at one point have been taken out of their home and placed in the residential facilities. We can't continue to operate at this and then expect the same results or ignore the results that we're getting. Is that we have a disproportionate overrepresentation of people of color, you know, in our system. So it's something that we need to talk about. So I want to thank you for being a part of that. And I want you to, let's start. When I say now, we can take a breath. Let's go forward. So, Mimi, we're going to take a break now. We're going to start going on to the next session. So, hey, Mimi, I want to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Cameron. Really appreciate that talk. And you know, I'm big on consistent feedback. And I'm huge on community-based participatory action research too. You know, what we're doing right now is definitely going to be carried forward through research and, you know, folks that are looking in to what we're talking about today. And so I want to hear from you. A lot of times, and I'm talking to the to all of our 141 participants that are on Zoom, and maybe the few other 100 that are chiming in on Facebook. And I just want to know, I want to hear from you. From what Cameron brought to us today, I need one word. What's one word that you can draw from what you've heard, from what you've learned, maybe relearned, maybe unlearned? Go ahead and chat that in the box for a moment before we move on. Just one word. Dehumanization. Thank you, Alex. One word. Unacceptable, absolutely. It's time to put a stop to it. Not surprised. Yeah. Yeah. Very disappointing. And is there another Mimi? Okay, nice. Love that name. Disappointed, absolutely. Institutionalized, 100%. Unfair. Thank you, Claire. Hey, Elise, we're glad that you're here. Indignant, absolutely. Self-denial, traumatizing. Despicable. So go ahead and continue to do that. And so we're going to transition, not take a break, but we're going to transition. And so what we're going to do here is that we are going to allow you to click on a link. I'm actually going to put a link inside of the chat box, right? And I'm going to have you click on this link. It's going to bring up another window on your own computer. It's a 4-minute and some odd second video. And so what I'd like you to do is go ahead and click on that link, take a couple seconds, I'm putting it in right now, and watch that video. And then in about 4 minutes, we're gonna come back. So go ahead and do that now. Again, this is a webinar, but it is also interactive. So go ahead and do that and come back to us. I'm gonna do the same thing. And so as you're filtering back in, I want to take a quick poll. If before you saw this flyer, if before you heard about this training, did you know what adultification bias is? Just say yes or no in the chat. I see several no's. I see a couple yeses. I'm going to wait until we see almost 100 people respond. We're taking a poll. Again, it's all about the data. Lots of no's, a couple yeses here. It's okay, we'll remind you. Thanks, Emily, for that honesty. No, ma'am. Okay, now I've got to be a ma'am now. But all right. Lots of no's, few yeses. Looks like we're almost split here. Keep going. If you've never heard, did you know what adultification bias was before this panel? If you haven't answered, quickly go ahead and put it in the chat box. Yes or no. If you're on Facebook right now, go ahead and do the same. Yes or no. We want to compile this information. Give it about 15 more seconds. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so this study that was done, and first of all, let me just quickly thank one of our research partners in this work that we're doing with the Innocence Initiative. It's Georgetown University. They have been a champion for the work that Measure and the rest of the Innocence Initiative has been doing to address adultification bias, to take research and put it to local action, to understand how data could be used to fuel social change and to mobilize communities around it. So let me give you a little bit of background. So last November, my organization, Measure, partnered with Hearts to Heal, Lone Star Justice Alliance, Community Advocacy and Healing Project, and also Girl Scouts of Central Texas to launch, again, the Innocence Initiative after receiving a grant from Impact Austin, from St. David's Foundation, and Greater Mount Zion Church. And thank you to them, because that this has made this training for all of you possible. The Innocence Initiative is a multifaceted approach to dismantling adultification bias of Black girls in Central Texas. So feel free, and if someone would help me here to chat Measure's website in the chat box for people to take down, but feel free to visit our website. You'll see a link that says the Innocence Initiative, where you can kind of get more information and also more data about the work that we're doing, and also to get involved. So let's be crystal clear here. Adultification bias is a social or cultural stereotype that's based on how adults perceive children in absence of knowledge of the child's behavior and verbalization, according to Georgetown University's report on Girlhood Interrupted. With adultification, racial stereotypes become more important than the fact that they're even children, depriving them of the safety and security that they would have been granted otherwise. And so you can also look into just some more deep reading and thinking and learning. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's done some fantastic work around intersectionality, understanding what it looks like to be a girl and Black, and how these different intersects create even more issues for the human, right? And so it's very rare to receive both training and the opportunity to sit and to hear from an expert panel to connect your learning tools to real life. But y'all, we're going to do that today. And so Dr. Ebony and Angel, I'm going to introduce you guys. If you guys want to both put on your camera. There you go. We're going to go ahead and let me give you guys a proper introduction though. So Dr. Ebony is passionate about helping women survivors thrive in trauma recovery. She is specifically trained to work with a variety of clients with issues related to depression, anxiety, and other stressors. And other stress responses. Dr. Ebony also specializes in guiding women to develop skills that increase their effectiveness in interpersonal interactions, including communication and asking for and getting what you want and need. Ooh, girl, I need that. Dr. Ebony is specifically interested in issues that impact marginalized communities. I'm also very happy to say that Dr. Ebony is partnered with Measure in a new mentorship program that we've developed called the Travis County Girl Squad. And the Travis County Girl Squad is a pilot program for 10 girls at a time that have been recently incarcerated or have had some type of negative impact to their family due to COVID-19. And so these girls are going to be meeting monthly with Dr. Ebony and her partner, Dr. Bernasha. They're also going to be assigned several a mentor, a Black woman mentor in Travis County to help them along the way. The program is a year long at a time. So we're really excited to have Dr. Ebony join us. And then also joining in the conversation today is Angel Carroll, who serves as the Emerging Adult Outreach Coordinator, facilitating and coordinating a robust community engagement strategy for Lone Star Justice Alliance and transformational justice programs. With experience, lived experience in the foster care and juvenile justice systems, Angel is dedicated to improving outcomes for youth in Texas who are system involved. So let me begin real quick with Angel. Angel, you are a phenomenal advocate with an incredible story of triumph in the face of having to endure adultification bias and everything else. Would you take us down that journey?
Yeah. Yes, thank you all for having me today. I grew up in Georgetown, Texas, which is about 30 miles north of Austin. I had a fairly normal life growing up. Right before I started 6th grade, however, I learned that my stepfather had died in Iraq. I began having behavioral problems at school, but my history was irrelevant to those that were, in charge of my education throughout the day and the week. At age 10, I was told that I looked 16 and that I was too mature. I was told because I was mature, I could figure out how to sit next to another student every day who had sexually assaulted me years before. My white peers were allowed to wear shorts to school, and I wasn't. I was told that it showed my shape too much. And that the other guys who I went to school with, I didn't want to be too tempting to them. When I expressed that there was a need for tutoring and other resources, they placed me in special ed. At one point, my AVID teacher had told me that I needed to listen to her because what she told me in class was going to be important in making sure that I didn't end up pregnant at 16 like the other girls who lived in Southeast Georgetown, which is an area that is predominantly Black and Hispanic. And when I spoke up for myself, I was considered defiant, argumentative, placed in ISS, essentially going to alternative school and then JJEAP and being referred into juvenile services. Unfortunately, when I was in juvenile services, for the first time, I got the counseling that I needed. But that was at the cost of a record and confinement. I think it's really important to realize that Black girls, we shouldn't be written off as different and defiant and denied resources and access to resources just because of adultification biases. And I hope that you guys are able to just hear my experiences and those of other young Black girls. And it truly does, it harms us. There's trauma that I have experienced in my past and that I'm still dealing with today based off of that adultification.
Thank you, Angel, for being so candid. And you mentioned how you weren't allowed to wear shorts, right? Same, I've had that same experience. I was actually 8 years old or so, and I had finally gotten a pair of these biker shorts that had like Mickey Mouse or Minnie Mouse on the side. I'm probably aging myself right now if anybody used to wear those, but very early 90s. And my girlfriends at school had always worn them, but I finally got them one Christmas. And when I walked, and I believe I lived in California, right? So, and so when I came to school that day with my new biker shorts on, that everybody else had always been wearing, I was turned around and told to go back home by my principal, who looked at me like almost with disgust. And looked at me directly in the eyes and said, I can't believe you're wearing that. You need to go home right now and change. What I hadn't really, and I took that walk home, and that walk was the walk of shame. And honestly, I just opened up to my mom about what happened that day, just about a year ago when I started the Innocence Initiative. And so, you know, my mom never knew why I came home that day and rushed and changed clothes, but I had felt nasty that day. I felt, and it was unbeknownst to myself, I've never ever experienced sexuality until that moment. And for that moment to be the moment that I experienced sexuality, from the principal's judgment of me, absence of my own knowledge, was least to say problematic. And so understand that story. And so moving along, Dr. Ebony, you have done some, extensive research into the modern day scripts that are used to stereotype and in some cases adultify Black girls. Can you break down those scripts and compare them to the other scripts? And I was going to say more known, but it's not really always more known, because we know that our audience, half of them have no, are just learning about adultification bias in terms of the Mammy, Sapphire, and the Jezebel.
Yeah, so I'll give some background and just kind of like one-liners about it. I think to break it down would take way more than just the minutes that we have here. But historically, there have been several scripts associated with Black women, and these scripts have been used to stereotype Black women with regard to their characteristics, with regard to their sexual expression, with regard to how they see themselves and how they identify, express, and navigate their sexual experiences and interactions with others. So historically, there's the Mammy, the Sapphire, and the Jezebel. And the Sapphire and Matriarch are ones that go hand in hand. And I'm just going to provide some information here about what those are. So the Mammy is the African-American woman who is characterized as maternal. She's nurturing, she's family-oriented, she's a church lady who is all self-sacrificing, does not place herself at the forefront. She takes care of the needs of her family and others. She's the one who, this stereotype was created during slavery to kind of promote the idea of slavery as an institution that not only benefited the natural disposition of African descendants, but was one that helped African Americans, like basically to embrace themselves, like you're nurturing, you're caring, that kind of thing, as if that was something to be proud of. The Jezebel stereotype is referred to also as the sexual siren. She's the African-American woman who is overly sexualized, and we'll see this a lot in how the population that you're talking about, Mimi, is talked about a lot, the adultification, right? So it's overly sexualized, aggressive, sexually promiscuous, uncaring, lacking in virtue, and a woman who would use her sexuality to manipulate and deceive. The image of the Jezebel is a woman who cares for nothing but her own sexual satisfaction. And then we have the Sapphire. The Sapphire is the angry Black woman. She's the hostile, aggressive, nagging wife of a dishonest, lazy, and pretentious African-American man. Typically, we saw this in movie roles. The central feature of these relationships is that the woman is looking to get rich. They exploit friends, those types of things, and they're deemed angry and ill-tempered and mean. They have no sympathy. They're seen as deserving of ill treatment. So that's the historical context. Those have not gone anywhere. They are still around, very present. They just take a different name. So in my dissertation that I did for my grad program was that looking at those in the modern context and saying, hey, how are these showing up now? And not only how are they showing up, how are Black women who look like me using that information to then internalize those stereotypes to then negotiate who they are and negotiate their sexual experiences. So some of the ones that we came up with are the new scripts. Those are the those are the gold digger, the video vixen, the diva, the boss. And in earlier times, probably like in the early 90s, you had the dyke. This was the woman who was physically and sexually, emotionally attracted to women. You had the ride or die chick. This is the woman who is going to ride for her man no matter what, mostly within the context of violence and drugs. And so as we can see, these same themes run deep modernly. They haven't gone anywhere. They just take on a different name. And today we have the social media influencer. We still have the gold digger. We have the boss. Boss bitch basically is how that is described. We have the nagging one, the sassy one. We have the freak. We have the video vixen still, video girl. So those things are still very prevalent. And with the kind of, as social media presence increases, a lot of these things are being shown out and shown in the ways that we portray ourselves, depict ourselves in social media, and the way that others are portraying and depicting us as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ebony. And again, I want to kind of pitch it back to all of our attendees here. In what ways has adultification bias? Now remember, this is absent of the girl's behavior. This is how adults perceive her. How has that shown up? And I'm going to ask, the participants to chime in again on this chat, but how has adultification bias reared its ugly head in your work? Have you had an instance where you've had to fight against it? Have you seen it but didn't speak up? Have you seen it but spoke up? Just wondering how it's impacted your work. And I'll go ahead and give a couple of seconds here so that we can start seeing how adultification has shown up. If you don't, or maybe you haven't seen it at all, and maybe you want to share that too in the chat. But just wondering, how it has impacted your work. We'll go ahead and give it a couple seconds. It could be super brief too. Doesn't have to be a long paragraph, just a quick, brief statement how you've seen it, how you fought back, how you may have realized it now. There's a lot of people that tend to wake up afterwards and say, oh my God, that was that. I mean, even myself, when I felt that, that pressure from my principal, I had no idea what it was. I couldn't name it until now. And so just kind of wondering. Absolutely, assumption of a female client's involvement in human trafficking, right? How many times is the victim turned into the assailant, right? Like how many times? How many times have we seen that story played out over and over and over again? Give it a couple more seconds. Yeah. I have a client who was subject to dental exams by ICE to determine his age. Right. Working in residential treatment, detainment, and replacement of Black girls. Right. A couple more feedbacks. Right. Girls have to take on adult responsibilities in their families. Right. Absolutely. And there's a very finite line, right, with that, because children should have chores and children should have responsibilities, but adultification bias, once you really read into it and understand it, it gets a little bit deeper. Thanks, Dax. Haven't seen it personally because I've only been practicing a year, but it's there for sure. And now you're really going to be able to identify it. Thank you. We'll go ahead, continue to use that chat box as I ask these questions to our panelists and get their feedback. Use that chat box to ask questions, because at the end, hopefully we'll have some time to get to some of those questions. But if we can't get to those questions, hopefully we can field those questions later But again, I want to continue this interactive conversation, silent conversation from the panelists, but will be conversation if I can kind of draw that into the to what the doctor and Angel are talking about. And so Angel, I'm going to pitch it back to you. So you testified at the Supreme Court of Texas and Texas Court of Criminal Appeals at the historic first ever joint session advocating for a statewide commission as a foundation for collaborative among judges and policymakers and mental health experts to improve outcomes for youth. Can you tell us, like, what was that like? How did it impact your confidence to disrupt? And especially after going through your own journey, like, can you just kind of bring us there while you were in that seat?
Yeah, I think that leading up to it, I knew that I wanted to let my voice and my story be heard. What got me through a lot of the abuse in the foster care system and everything was an anger. It was a mix of anger and passion at the same time, because I was like, if I can just get through this, then I can let my voice and my story be heard. So it was, in a way, a full circle moment. There were many times where I had it was behavior problems, and other times it was mental health. And it didn't seem like people could see the system could see the difference in that. And so being able to share my story and knowing that there are thousands of other kids in the system that look like me, that may not look like me, that are going and have gone through the things that I went through, it was a great opportunity and experience for me. And I think that it's important to listen to those that are system impacted and have us at the table, but when we're at the table, to listen to us as well as we make changes. And so I've been grateful for that opportunity and look forward to continue pushing for change.
I appreciate that. And you said listen to us, right? And
Yeah.
so I've been involved in several conversations over the last couple of weeks, you know, in light of what's going on in the world today about racism and dismantling racism and like what, you know, white allies should be doing. And you mentioned listening. And so that's one of the, you know, things I always say, just listen, just listen, just listen. But I started to add on another word, right? With that listen, and it's more of an actionable word, and that's believe. So listen, but also believe. Believe the stories of Black girls. Believe the stories of Black boys. When they tell you, listen and believe. And so that then turns you into not just, you know, hearing, because we all can do that, but it turns you into actually advocating. That's a real, that, you know, the ability to advocate, right? And so it turns into you saying, I advocate for her because I am her. That's more, it's internal. I speak up for her because I am her. You know, I protest for her because I am her. And you can use that her, you know, you can say them, they, whoever, you know, you want to put in that sentence, but it then becomes more of an action that you are charged with doing. And I hope that speaks to all of the amazing advocates that we have in this training today. And so, Dr. Ebony, I know you're passionate about helping others recover from diet culture, while also learning to shape their health in a more empowered manner. I want you to talk a little bit about body and the Black girl and how it's been weaponized and used as a tool for adultification bias and how it impacts the Black girl.
Yeah, and that is so complex. Like it's a lot of layers associated with that. But as we kind of discussed how the maturity and kind of like seeing Black girls as older than they are, and then putting stipulations on what they can wear based on somebody else's opinions about how their body looks. Diet culture was actually created for this very reason. Diet culture is actually oppressive to all who partake in it, because all of us have been conditioned to be kind of like within the diet culture. That's just the world that we live in. It's everywhere. Specifically, it is oppressive to Black bodies, people of color, And it is deeply embedded in the system of racism, because the whole diet and what we think is best for your size has been created out of, here's what we think is better for you, and here's how we think you should take care of your body and look, and we're going to tell you what's best for your body. So at the core of diet culture is wiping away your ability to trust your body, trust yourself, to make decisions for yourself, for your body, and learning how to be in tune with that and listen to what that sounds like. So once that's wiped away, and then we have full control over what you eat, the things that we place in your communities, and then we're going to blame you for partaking in those things, and then for the impact that those things have on your body. So when we talk about diet culture, body size, body image, a lot of this has been systematically or systemically placed on people of color, children of color, and then called an obesity epidemic. And it's something that individuals should be shameful about, something that they should correct without emphasis being placed on the system that has allowed these things to take place. And so when you look at young bodies, especially young girls' bodies, and the way in which we are maturing and the way in which our bodies are developing, there's always blame on the person, basically the victim, but there's never any responsibility taken for the lack of resources or the lack of things that are available to us to actually understand how to make healthy food choices, how to have a healthy relationship with food, how to improve our balance, and those kinds of things. And instead, we're just kind of, again, the same thread and the same theme is there. Let's blame the victim. Let's blame the person. And the more there is a lack of resources, the more there are food deserts, the more this will impact how we show up. And then we're made to feel shameful for our body size. Like historically, I was reading a book by Sabrina Strings called Fearing the Black Body. And she lays out historically how this fear of having bodies that look like ours has developed. So we have the systemic things that are happening with the lack of food and the food choices that are made available. But historically, the whole diet culture was created in rebellion to having bodies that look like ours. So we talk about the woman, the Black woman who had the large butt, who was put on display for as in the circus, and people paid money to come see her large butt. And so there was this idea that if white women can shrink their bodies, then they can begin to look opposite of Black women. And so this whole thing was this whole thinning of the waist, slimming down, becoming really frail, really thin, was in direct opposition to having a body that looked like Black women, having a curvy body. And so then that was placed on us as something to be ashamed of. And then so as young girls have these bodies that are curvy, we're made to feel like that is something to be ashamed of, that is something that is wrong, and actually inviting of people to take advantage of them. So it's so many layers, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about any one thing that I said, but this is so multifaceted and so complex that we have to go way back historically to even understand why diet culture was created in the first place, and how that has then impacted us in ways that we show up with shame and guilt as relates to our bodies ourselves. And then that then invites other people to view us in ways that further harm us and cause us damage.
Thank you for that. And just to, kind of piggyback on one small piece and then tie it to even a question that we have in the chat box, Terrence asked, can someone discuss how adultification is different in girls than in boys? Let me just kind of give a little bit of statistics and data, because that's just how I talk. But, so according to the study by Georgetown, Girlhood Interrupted, and you guys take down this note if you haven't read the study, please do so front to back. Girlhood Interrupted, it's a quick Google search. And so, for minor violations, Black girls are more likely to be disciplined, right, for subjective infractions. So for minor violations like dress code, of course, that have a lot to do with the body, like you were just talking about, Dr. Ebony, improper cell phone use, loitering, Black girls are penalized 2 times more than white girls. Black boys, on the other hand, are penalized still at a disproportionate rate, 1.3 times more than white boys. For disobedience, Black girls were found to be disciplined 2.5 times more than white girls, whereas Black boys still, again, problematic, 1.5 times more than white boys. For disruptive behavior, Black girls this is really where it gets real serious, right? Were 3 times more penalized than white girls, whereas Black boys were penalized 1.5 times more than white boys. And then for fighting, Black girls 3 times as much than white girls. Black boys 1.6 times as much than white boys. And then for bullying and harassing, and I'm sorry to lay all this data down, but I think that this really will answer that question for you, Terrence. Black girls were penalized 3 times more than white girls, whereas Black boys 1.5 times than white boys. And so again, thank you, Precious, for putting that in the chat box. Measure has done a lot of work around pulling data around this issue. You can click on that link later on to find out more information, but I hope that helps. And again, Philip Goff has done some really interesting studies too, how adultification bias does show up for Black boys. And again, this work is multifaceted. Brown girls also, right? So we're talking about Black girls right now, but definitely brown girls also. There's those disproportionalities that we can continue to work on. And so what Dr. Ebony Ann Angel, as we kind of continue to have these conversations, and again, I want to urge attendees to put questions inside the chat box, but how can a defender, and Angel, you might be able to really chime in here too, but how can a defender best identify if a child is suffering criminalizations due to those scripts that Dr. Ebony talked about? And like, how can we protect them? Now, I know that we're going to learn a lot about this, especially in our next portion where Elizabeth Henneke comes in, but in your own experience and your own thoughts, how can defenders best identify if a child is going through this issue?
Yeah, so I would first start by saying, after Elizabeth presents, you guys will be given a lot of information and research, as Phoebe has already mentioned. Call it out. I think that's the best thing. That's the best start, is to call it out. Also looking into just the trauma of what that client has gone through. When I believe I was in 7th grade and something had happened at school and I walked away from the resource officer. And I think I put my headphones in, I was just walking down the hallway. All I wanted to do was to get out of that situation, because what my trauma was telling me was that I needed to leave. And so I left. And all of a sudden, all I remember is that there were large man hands on my shoulder. And I immediately flinched. Because of my trauma, that was my response to that. And I ended up getting arrested, going into detention, and being a public servant. There are many lawyers here. You all know that had the potential to, I would not be standing in front of you guys, sitting in front of you all, had those charges been filed. Luckily for me, I had an attorney ad litem who looked at my past, who realized that this young woman has experienced trauma, and let's just take a step back and think about why this happened. And she called that out, and I'm internally and forever grateful for that. And so that would be like the first step that I would say.
Fantastic. And you mentioned you had, luckily, you said luckily.
Luckily, yeah.
Luckily you had a woke advocate.
I did. Ledesma, she was great. I don't even know, I think I may have been one of her few clients in the area at that time. So I mean, just imagine.
Yeah. What was really interesting about that study, just for candid conversation real quick too, and Dr. Ebony, I want to bring you in on this one too, is that in that study that looked at adultification bias, they saw that it was across cultures of people that looked at Black girls in this manner. So it wasn't just like white people and how they perceive Black girls, or it wasn't just, a certain person, right? They looked at it, they said all people. So even in our own community as Black women, we need to start thinking and understanding that when we say stuff like, girl, you trying to be fast, Or you trying to be hot in the pants? How many times did I hear that as growing up? And honestly, I mean, I did. I became a teen mom, like very early. Pushed through my own struggles and everything, but internalized all of that. I remember being called Jezebel at 13 years old by a loved one. Sometimes we're even seeing this, especially happening with Black boys, right? So we're having these, it's cool and macho now, so you haven't had this yet, or you haven't done this yet, and we're setting this bar, right, of a sexuality on our kids in ways that are just completely, honestly, sick. And so, and I got to be honest with you too. I've even looked on a social media post in a prominent group, and saw that they had a post of a little Black girl who was standing by a number 5 on the beach because she was celebrating her birthday, and she had on a bikini. At 5 years old, we know this was her 5th birthday because this was her birthday picture, and they had literally made her infamous because someone had put a tag on that picture. Would you let your daughter wear this to the beach? And so the disgusting nature and how deep adultification bias comes out and reveals itself needs to be called out. And it needs to be called out in every facet in the criminal justice system and at home. And so how can we as advocates to remember our duty, not just in front of the court, not just at school as we're teaching and educating, but also at home? How can we be real, true disruptors to adultification bias?
I think we have to first recognize that there's a bias. I don't really know so I'm thinking about my own childhood experiences, right? And I think that if you ask my mom if she's biased, she would say, no, I'm not biased. I'm telling you what you need to do to protect yourself, right? And because I also received a message of, don't wear skirts, don't dance in front of men, don't sit on men's laps. And now I know that that was from her own experiences and her own fears. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do my dissertation on the internalization of these stereotypes is because we have largely internalized a lot of these same messages, and we continue to spread them on through generations. So she also internalized those scripts and identified women as the problem and men as who they are just going to be. And so it's not just white people, I agree with you, that look at us this way. We also look at ourselves this way. We look at our children this way. We send messages to our children. We talk to them in these ways. We help them shape their narrative about their behaviors in these ways. I remember being told that if I had sex as a teen, I was a freak. Being told that if I liked anybody who was the same sex, I was disgusting and a freak. So these ways that we identify and place these messages onto people who look like us and our children, it really takes some education first around how this has impacted us and what this is doing to us, and that is actually not protective, is actually very harmful, so that people can understand the depth and the extent to which this is impacting us as Black women and how we identify and navigate this space in this world. And so I think that I would start by saying we have to recognize that there's a bias, because I don't really think that people understand that there is one. Because you have to remember, and I always say this about the conferences that we go to. We go to these site conferences and these professional conferences, and we're talking to ourselves. What I'm really proud of is that the dissemination of this article and this research study that was widespread, because a lot of the research that we do as professionals, especially I know within the realm of psychology, is us disseminating information amongst ourselves. And sometimes that information doesn't get back to the populations that it needs to. And so we need to provide some education and disseminate this information more widely so that people are aware of what's happening and what we know to be true and happening with us.
I would also ask that when you have juvenile clients that you've identified have been victims of adultification bias, that you talk to them and tell them that it's okay. When I talked about my 6th grade AVID teacher telling me that I was going to get pregnant by 16 if I didn't listen to her, I wasn't interested in boys. boys weren't on my mind, but now you've placed this idea in my head that, all right, I don't want to be like this. And the behavior that I'm showing in class is somehow correlated to that. And I think back on it, and I think how that just changed the way that I looked at just boys having children in the future. And it affected me in a negative manner. As I've begun this work, I didn't know about adultification bias till recently. And it was really disheartening because I had this idea of my childhood. And yes, it wasn't perfect and I went through a lot, but my middle school years in a way were sacred. And I was explaining to a friend, we were friends in 6th grade and we've been friends since. And I was telling her about this training, and she's white and she was just like, oh my goodness. She was like, you were so nice in middle school. You didn't mess with anybody. You weren't a bully. You stood up for individuals. The only time you were considered angry and disruptive was when you were sticking up for yourself and others. And so I really wish that I had someone that told me, it's okay. I see it. We're going to get through this. I didn't have an ally. And so, again, I just ask that just talk to those Black girls and Black boys and people of color that are experiencing that, and let them know that you see it, and just redirect those negative comments, because we need it. I needed it. And I wish someone had been there for me.
Thank you. I'm getting really excited to start to transition into our next part of the training, but I just wanted to take another poll real quick, get the audience involved real quick. Is this helping so far? Now we're not done, but so far I need you to answer yes, no, or eh. You know that eh, like like, EHH, eh. Let us know. Just constant feedback is always important. All right. Now, no bad words. Okay. No bad words, but a yes, no, or is this helping? Is this going to help you be a better advocate? And you know what? You mentioned, again, I'm going to go back, Angel. You said, luckily, that you had an advocate that was woke to adultification bias. And as our panelists are chiming in a yes, no, or or, I want to let you guys know that Measure and Lone Star Justice Alliance are committed to making sure that kids that are facing criminalization have advocates that can and are equipped to advocate for them. Okay, and so we're going to be developing a tech solution. It'll probably just be a quick little landing page on the website of lawyers that have gone through this training and that understand it, so that when because I know me as an advocate, I constantly have parents reaching out, Mimi, I need a lawyer. Mimi, I need someone to represent my daughter. Mimi, she wasn't doing anything. Mimi, and so I almost never have a pool to reach out to. And so I'm going to, we're going to reach out, we're going to get your name and your information. If this is a passion for you to protect kids and understand that this training needs to be applied in the system. And so again, just one more quick little piece, right, is that the Travis County Girl Squad, which we're about to embark on, all of us really, right? Like Angel, you're going to be helping train some of our mentors. Dr. Ebony is really leading the fight. And so, program manager Maria Brown Spence with Hearts to Heal, like we're super excited about this. But again, we want to make sure that we have that the pool of girls in there are girls that need us the most, prioritizing. So we're definitely prioritizing crossover youth first. Girls that have been incarcerated, girls that have had a negative impact due to COVID-19. These girls get a laptop, they get a monthly stipend of $100 for just participating, which is super important, right? They also get another stipend of $100 for just food to support their families or their selves, right? They get monthly sessions with Dr. Ebony and Dr. Bernasha. They get mentorship from other Black women. A lot of times mentorship goes a long way. Just seeing another Black woman that is successful and that is doing things and that has also triumphed the same way they are going to triumph, like that is so important. And so we are going to be providing an opportunity for you to pass this on to your clients so that they're able to participate in this program.
Can I offer something to clarify? I want to just kind of make sure that we are clear, just if you're going to see your participants this way, that we are not providing therapy to the clients, that we're providing support and mentorship. That's it. And I'm here to help us if there's any issues that arise that need to be taken up for as far as mental health concerns. I want to make sure that I'm providing some space where people feel like I can be a liaison or triage to provide the girls with the help that they need and getting them the resources that they need. So making sure that we understand that this is in no way group therapy or therapy.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification. And so someone on Facebook asked how to become a mentor. And so that has been a process for Hearts to Heal. I'll make sure that that we connect with that person on Facebook to let them know how to volunteer with our group. And so, you know, at this point, I just want to thank Angel and Dr. Ebony for participating in this conversation. Again, a lot of times you don't get training and lived experience all in one lump, but we have managed to do that today for all of our amazing participants. And so thank you. And so, you know, right now, let's go ahead and transition to our final stage of training. And so Elizabeth Henneke is the director of Lone Star Justice Alliance. That's a nonprofit legal organization that improves the lives of youth and emerging adults in the justice system. She strives on juvenile counsel, or she serves, on, and she probably like thrives on the juvenile counsel for the State Bar of Texas, the Federal Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice, and several other organizations. Elizabeth has been a clinical instructor for the University of Texas's National Security and Human Rights Clinic, and was the inaugural Audrey Armis Clinical Teaching Fellow at the University of Southern California. Go Cali. And since founding Lone Star Justice Alliance, Elizabeth has received the Travis County Women Lawyers Association Attorney Award. She's been recognized as the Austin Under 40 Award winner in the legal category at the same year, or last year actually, that I was awarded that same honor and award for nonprofit service. She was also named a finalist in Divi Champions for Change Rising Star Award in both 2008 and in 2019. My friend, my sister, my confidant in this work. Let me introduce you all to Elizabeth Henneke.
Thank you, Mimi. I'm humbled to follow such an incredible group of women and Cameron who are able to really bring to light the heart of what we're doing today. I have the unenviable position of following that with some real just concrete tools. So we're going to talk about tools, but before we get started, if I can make this work, here we go. I'm going to launch our first poll. So I'm not as, and you can now enter into, you should all be getting a poll that asks what your experiences are prior to today. So all of you attendees have been asked to answer these questions about, have you ever raised race in your practice prior to today? The second question is, have you ever seen racial bias against your clients? And then the third question is, have you ever raised concerns about the PACT and any racial bias that might be inherent in that assessment? I think it's just really useful for us as a community to begin this presentation understanding where everybody's starting. Because what my hope is that we'll revisit this question at the end of this training and we'll find out where we all are as a community of folks who are dedicated to moving forward with this work and serving our clients in the best way possible. Because what I know is that all of you who have joined here today have already made a step forward, and we're so grateful to you for that. So I'm going to give it 20 more seconds. So if you haven't voted, please do. We've got over half of you voting. That's great participation. Please do join so that we can understand a little bit more about you and your practice before we even get started. Okay, thank you everyone who's voted. I'm going to end the polling now. And I'm going to share the results so that everybody can see what the results were. So about 71% of you have raised race in your practice. I'm super excited to hear that. And we're going to ask you later in the presentation that if you have developed motions or materials to please send them to the Lone Star Justice Alliance so that we can begin to compile an avenue to share those materials out. It sounds like 96% of you have seen racial bias against your clients. What a unsurprising but startling statistic. And then only 18% of you have ever raised concerns about PACT, and 37% of you aren't aware of what the PACT is. So the PACT is the assessment that every juvenile probation officer in the state of Texas conducts on your clients. We might just have to have a follow-up training about that now that I've seen that. Okay, that is great information. It really contextualizes the presentation that we're about to have. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can go right into the presentation. Hi, sorry, I am not the most technological. Okay, so let's go back a slide real quick. First, let's start about materials and where you can actually get started. So there are 3 important materials for you to understand and to utilize. First, I want to make sure that everyone, if you haven't gotten a copy of the National Juvenile Defense Standards, that you do so. This is a critically important resource for you to utilize because it sets the bar for where you should be advocating in your practice. You're going to find minimum standards on how to present information to your clients in pleas, how to interact with your clients when they're in police custody. It is a great understanding of what your minimum expectations are as a juvenile defender. Second is, of course, the Dawson book, the juvenile law book presented by the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. I'm excited to say it was co-authored in part by Nydia Thomas, who has since left TJJD and joined the Lone Star Justice Alliance. And that is an incredible resource for just understanding everything there is to know about Texas law. And it should be the first place you start whenever you're starting to challenge cases. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to the Racial Justice for Youth Toolkit. And we will post the link to that in the chat so that you can find this toolkit. It's an incredible toolkit which will give you all sorts of information about how to raise racial justice in your practice. It's brought to you by the National Juvenile Defender Center, who actually helped us prepare this training today, in particular Chris Henning. And I want to draw your attention to the case advocacy component of this website. If you go there, you will find resources such as pleadings and an entire bibliography of implicit bias racial studies. This is, I think, at the last printing, I printed it, nearly 100 pages of studies that you're going to be able to utilize in your practice. It summarizes the studies. It gives you tips on how these studies can be utilized. There's also an incredible resource called Raising Race Checklist that you can go through and utilize so that it gives you at each stage of your practice what you should be considering and how the race bias studies might influence your considerations when you're practicing. Those 2 materials alone are worth a visit, and we'll of course follow up with all participants with links to those items, and most of them will also be co-hosted on Lone Star Justice Alliance's webpage under our Reimagine Justice program, which is our new race equity program that will launch on Juneteenth. With those resources, how should we even start? So when and how can we raise race? So You can raise it at all stages of the proceedings. So you want to start at immediately in the source of referrals. So this is about whether referrals are coming from schools, whether referrals are coming from particular neighborhoods. You're going to look at prosecutorial discretion. There is case law that actually does limit prosecutorial discretion if it's influenced by implicit bias or race. You can look at detention hearings. We're going to talk extensively about raising race at detention hearings. Challenging transfer, really this is challenging certifications. You can challenge you can use it when looking at Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, challenging identifications. As Mimi mentions, there are cross-bias identifications. Of course, you're going to look at, if you go to trial, at the credibility of the officer's complaints. You can look at whether or not to remove GPS, obviously disposition and post-disposition. So that gives you a sense where we're going to go with this. Now let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about the framework for incorporating race in adolescence and litigation. So first, you want to talk about it, investigation and discovery. So you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. What do I need to know to raise race in adolescence? You started on that journey with this training, but you also need to make sure what statistical data and reports do I need. This could often involve asking for discovery from the prosecutor's office, but it may also involve filing Public Information Act requests. I'm going to show you throughout the presentation a sense of localized Central Texas data so that you have a sense of the kind of richness of data that you can request. If you ever need to understand data and you don't even know how to get started, please reach out to us at the Lone Star Justice Alliance and we will be happy to help you craft your data request so that you can begin to understand it. Second, you need to know the law, right? What legal principles might be implicated at the intersection of race and adolescence? And how do I overcome the legal barriers to raising and litigating race? We'll talk a little bit about when you raise a motion just to educate a judge, even if you know you're not going to succeed. We believe that that often is just as worthy as actually succeeding on a motion. Next, you're going to look at facts. So what facts do I need to elicit through either testimony or exhibits to raise race in adolescence? What witnesses and experts, what might I need in the process? I'm aware that often in juvenile practice, that there's because it is a non-adversarial system in many counties, that often defense counsel will work with probation or work with law enforcement to craft solutions for their children. But it is often appropriate as well to begin to develop experts, prepare for trial in such a way that you can actually flush some of these components out. Lastly, you want to look at the science. How can I incorporate empirical racial bias and adolescent development research into my advocacy? Again, I highly recommend this bibliography that we will link to you and send to you. And then last, how can I address institutional and systemic reform? We think this is a very important moment in time for all defenders to be engaged in this work. So ask yourself, how can I advocate for change, both in this case and beyond? You can start and begin by looking at detention hearings. So you want to start by citing studies. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. And you want to cite the studies generally on racial bias. You also want to cite statistics in your own juvenile probation facilities through public information request or FOIA request to probation or whoever the arresting officer is. And then you can also cite statistics from the school they attend. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So one of the statistics that Mimi keeps talking about is Black girls in the juvenile justice system. So a statistic you might use is to raise in your petition that Black girls are 20% more likely than white girls to be formally petitioned. You may raise these national statistics that show that Black girls are 2.7 times more likely than white females to be referred. And so you might raise the issue in the detention facility that says, well, we need to be careful not to widen the net for our Black girls, for those who are people of color, so that we don't continue to perpetuate these racial bias. You can use the national statistics to do so. You can also cite to local statistics. So this is an example of probation violations based upon school misconduct. So if your kid comes in and we're looking at a probation violation, You might point out to the judge that, for instance, in Georgetown ISD, African Americans make up only 4% of the population, but there were 8.5% of students suspended. Now compare that to white students who are a little bit more than 47% of the enrollment, but actually are only nearly 3% of students suspended. So you might bring that to the attention of your judge and make sure that you're arguing that we need to be especially critical when Georgetown ISD refers someone for school misconduct before we revoke their probation or find them with probation violations. You can also turn to look at institutional racism bias studies. So this is an example of one of the larger studies. This study examined whether racial disparities in school discipline are at least in part driven by racial stereotypes that can lead to the escalation of teachers' negative responses to Black students over the course of multiple teacher-to-student interactions. And what it found is that racial disparities can occur even when students are being disciplined for the exact same behavior. They found that teachers' disparate reaction to similar behavior by students from different racial groups may cause repeated misbehavior, so it actually escalates the targeted population, and that this Black escalation effect is exemplified by racial disparities in school suspensions, particularly where students have been suspended for 2 or more times. So what does this look like in moving forward with your pretrial detention? So as you know, pretrial detention is one of the perhaps the most important decisions in our client's case because it predicts more than any other factor how likely our clients will be pulled further into the system and whether they will be removed from the community at disposition. We want to be really careful at this component because in 2016, Black youth made up 16% of the youth population, but 41% of the pretrial detention population, 41%. So you want to make sure that you start to look at these components. You can challenge probable cause on the papers in any case in which a police report includes a vague description of a suspect using race or racial indicators that led to the arrest of the client, especially when there's very little other information linking the client to the crime. You can argue that a description containing age and race alone in the description of the suspect does not establish probable cause to believe that the client committed the offense. In fact, there's case law back from 1969, Davis versus Mississippi, where the Supreme Court found when the only description of assailant was that he was a Black youth, it was illegal to detain, question, and fingerprint 24 Black youth. You should argue that IRB, that institutional racism research can likely affect the interpretation of the behavior of the officer. You should also challenge implicit bias in the evaluation of social factors at the detention hearing. So racial bias on the part of both the prosecutor and the juvenile probation officers may impact the recommendations as to pretrial release, and on the part of the judge may impact their decision. Such as because Black youth are perceived as more mature and more dangerous than their white counterparts. Defenders can incorporate implicit bias research into a motion to reduce detention or a motion to affect even disposition. Specifically, I'm going to give you specific tools. The defender should cite to research by Bridges and Steen. Again, that's going to be found in the bibliography. Finding probation officers are more likely to attribute crime to internal factors in Black youth compared to environmental factors for white youth. They're more likely to view Black youth as more responsible for their criminal behavior and likely to reoffend than white youth, resulting in more severe penalties, including confinement. You heard this today when Angel mentioned to you her own experience, that it was attributed to her own personal characteristics rather than the environmental factors that were plaguing her personal life. I want to also encourage you to be aware that risk assessments often have racially coded factors, such as the past incarceration of family members or unavailability of a parent who works long hours to supervise. Become familiar with the PACT, which is the instrument utilized by all juvenile probation officers in Texas. And make sure you understand how it is used in your jurisdiction. Anyone who's ever administered the PAC knows that there are many subjective questions. And juvenile defenders need to understand that juvenile probation officers are often asking more than 200 questions of your juvenile defense clients. Incredibly personal, incredibly revealing information. And you need to understand how that is used to calculate risk and how that risk is used in your client's cases. During your detention argument, identify those factors in the pact that will lead to an unfair outcome that perpetuates racial disparities. You also want to preempt consideration of factors with socioeconomic and racial implications by developing an alternative release plan, including presenting a schedule outlining how the client will be supervised were he or she to be released to the community, even if his parents work long hours. Another place where you can start to consider how to raise race is under certification. So as everyone knows, certification is when children in the juvenile justice system under the age of 16 are transferred to stand trial as adults in the adult system. You can often raise race in the context of a certification hearing. You can argue against the discriminatory application of certification provisions. For example, in 2016, although Black youth made up of only 16% of the youth population aged 10 to 17, they made up 53% of all youth judicially transferred to adult court. I want to sit with that for a minute. They made up only 16% of the juvenile population, yet 53% of the certified youth population. Transfer hearings often include a number of factors that could be negatively influenced by racial bias. For example, the Texas Family Code 54.02F asks the judge to consider at certification the sophistication and maturity of the child. Sophistication and maturity. As you heard Angel describe, as Mimi explained through the research, as Cameron highlighted, such a factor may have a disproportionate racial impact because Black youth are perceived as more mature. Children raised in difficult environments develop resilience that may be deemed sophistication. And differences exist between racial groups at the age of the onset of puberty. Therefore, what can you do at the certification hearing? You can cite statistics documenting racial disproportionality in the system. You can cite studies showing youth of color perceived as older, less innocent and more culpable. You can cite research showing youth across all racial groups are more amenable to treatment than adults. It's important that you put the actions of your youth in the context of standard adolescent behavior so that your children of color cannot be utilized and seen as more mature, leading to a fast track into the adult system. You can also raise race when you talk about the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. And I'm going to present an idea that Professor Chris Henning from Georgetown Law School has presented, which is asking whether the inquiry for the Fourth and Fifth Amendment shouldn't just be what a reasonable person or a reasonable child would feel under the circumstances presented, but rather what would a reasonable Black child do in the circumstance? And when you're thinking through the presentation going forward, I want you to stop for a moment and reflect upon the recent officer-involved shootings of Black men and women in this country. And think about the unrest that is happening throughout Austin, Dallas, Houston, throughout our country, because people of color, in particular Black people, perceive police as increased hostility. Whether you agree with that or not, I think you have to understand that when you're thinking about how a Black child might respond in that moment to aggression by law enforcement, it will be informed by all of the experiences playing out in real time right now. And so Chris Henning suggests that maybe our inquiry should be the reasonable Black child. So first, before we can even start, let's ground ourselves in what the standards are. So first, when you're looking at both the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, the Supreme Court has begun to recognize that kids are different. Therefore, a reasonable standard is not just a reasonable standard, reasonable person standard, but a reasonable child standard. So that's the current state of the law. And this is because their brain has developed in different ways, right? Adolescents are prone to higher risk behavior, in part because their brain is developing until their mid to late 20s. The Supreme Court has affirmed these developmental concepts in a series of cases indicating that youth does in fact matter. So you can hearken back and utilize in your practice cases like Roper versus Simmons, Graham versus Florida, Miller versus Alabama, and importantly, JDB versus North Carolina. Because in these cases, the Supreme Court says and recognizes that youth matters because they are immature and reckless. They're susceptible to peer pressure. And they are developing, so many of their own characteristics are transient by nature. In fact, they have much more capacity for rehabilitation than your average adults. And this becomes incredibly important by the time we hit JDB in North Carolina. There, the court says that youth often lack experience, perspective, and judgment to avoid choices that could be detrimental to them. So let's talk about what that looks like when you talk about the Fifth Amendment. So first, when we talk about Miranda, Miranda applies in situations in which the suspect is in custody. That is, where the suspect is deprived of his freedom in any significant way. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court recognized in JDB versus North Carolina that age is relevant to the Miranda custody analysis. The court stressed that children are particularly vulnerable to questioning by authority figures who carry more weight with young people than adults. Race can exacerbate the dynamic when the police officer or officers are of a different race than our clients. I recently worked with a young man who had pot in his car, and when the cops tried to pull him over, he decided to flee because that would have been his first offense, and he was absolutely terrified of the cops. He ended up with a failure or fleeing from police charge and was facing a serious felony as opposed to what would have otherwise been a minor misdemeanor. When I asked him, what were you thinking? He just said, I was scared of the police officers. Ask your clients what's motivating them in the moments that they move forward. Defenders should be creative about thinking about ways in which race may affect knowing, voluntary, and intelligent waivers of Miranda rights. We should consider whether a Black child felt more intimidated in the presence of one or more white officers. We have to consider why youth feel obligated to stay put and speak up. It's the power imbalance between the police officer and the child. They've been socialized to comply with adults. They have less experience with the law and rights. And importantly, I refer you again to the annotated bibliography so you can read Thomas Grisco's research on adolescents' compliance with law enforcement. In that research, Grisco makes clear that adolescents will comply with law enforcement with even minor interactions that may not rise to the level of custody had it been an adult, but a child perceives them to be in custody. Now turning to the Fourth Amendment, and I know I'm going fast, so feel free to chat to me, although I can't see it because of the way I've got my computer done. Maybe Angel will flag me. She's sitting next to me if some of you guys have questions in the comments. For Fourth Amendment, let's talk about whether race matters in a seizure analysis. First, let's talk about what are the levels of detention. So you can have a consensual encounter where people come upon one another. There can be a stop and frisk, or you can have an arrest. There are often times where youth and race are going to converge, right? When you're going to see, again, the power imbalance between the officer and the child and how they're, this is a repeat of the last slide, sorry. What you want to look at is a reasonable articulated, here we go. You want to look at a reasonable articulated suspicion. Should not include race as a factor, absent a detailed description of a particular suspect who committed a crime. We should be very alert for vague descriptions that limit the description of the suspect to their race in areas where many people would fit that description. We should challenge Terry stops for improper use of race or racially coded language to describe why the police had reasonable suspicion that a crime was afoot or that our client was involved. Examples of that can include key language like hostility, nervousness, flushed appearances, lack of eye contact, profuse sweating, excited speech, baggy pants, suspected gang activity. And for Latino males in a car, some police focus on religious items hanging in car windows. We want to be clear that because of the negative experience with school resource officers and with police, community resentment and hostile and aggressive encounters on the street, that what those examples of factors that are influencing the police may simply be responses to perceived threats that the police have towards people of color. Defenders should look for opportunities to draw from Justice Sotomayor's language in Calhoun versus United States, a case in which the assistant United States attorney argued, quote, "You've got African Americans, you've got Hispanics, you've got a bag full of money. Does that tell you a light bulb doesn't go off in your head and say, that's a drug deal?" Justice Sotomayor wrote in an opinion that the prosecutor here tapped a deep and sorry vein of racial prejudice that has run through the history of criminal justice in our nation. It is deeply disappointing to see a representative of the United States resort to this basic tactic more than a decade into the 21st century. Using the race of defendants as an argument for their guilt diminishes the dignity of our criminal justice system and undermines respect for the rule of law. We expect the government to seek justice, not fan the flames of fear and prejudice. So next time an officer comes to you and he tells you, it is based upon my experience that a Black person doesn't walk through this neighborhood, I hope you'll all cite to Calhoun versus United States. You should be aware, however, of Wren, W-H-R-E-N versus United States, which was a 1996 case that held that if a police officer makes a stop based upon a facts that support a probable cause, his subjective racially biased motivations for making that stop do not invalidate it. So how do you respond? You should respond to Wren by arguing that many of our cases harken back to the last century, such as Davis versus Mississippi in 1996, in which officers rounded up over 20 youth to question them about an alleged rape, in which only description of the assailant was a Black youth. And you should note that maybe Wren in 1996 has been challenged by the language in Calhoun versus United States in 2013. You should also look at the PC affidavit for arrest and search warrants to make sure that they weren't based upon vague descriptions resting on age and race alone. Push back against arguments that rely only on geographic area or neighborhood to establish probable cause where the neighborhoods targeted are Black neighborhoods. I know we have lots of folks from South Dallas, and as many of you know, we actually run a program in South Dallas. When people bring up Fair Park and use it as an opportunity to suggest that that alone justifies a stop, I hope that you will push back. Finally, defenders should educate the court on implicit racial bias by filing motions to suppress that incorporate implicit racial bias research. You can file a motion to authorize funds for an implicit bias expert who can explain the impact of the implicit racial bias on police officers' interpretation of ambiguous facts on the scene. Even if the court declines to authorize the funds or appoint an expert, the motion will educate the judge and potentially influence his or her ruling. And if all of those who are on this training today, the more than 175 of you began filing, and then 120 people who weren't allowed to join the training, but who will get copies, go out and in the next week begin to utilize this research and challenge these norms, we will see change. You must argue the influence of implicit racial bias undermines the objective basis claimed by the officer, that it improperly skews how they evaluated the facts on the scene and how they recollect the facts at the hearing on the motion to suppress. You can especially ask when evaluating consent, was the consent freely given and not coerced? Take into account the objective versus subjective tests. Take into account the personal experiences that drive the fears of your child that you're defending, and consider the vulnerable subjective state of the person who consents. When you add race, when you add the current situation to what is facing youth, I hope you'll see that this can change the way your practice develops. This is a really interesting new case in which the Seventh Circuit found that, citing police misconduct studies, that when a black man met an officer in a dark alley and the officer immediately inquired whether he was armed, that he was seized and not free to leave, that was that it was proper for why he ran away from the police. This is just a recap of some of what we've done. They found what factors went into deciding whether there's a reasonable suspicion that could have been guided by police when they just found a black man in an alley. The reasonable factors that the cop brought up were furtive gestures, that he believed he had a gun, he was looking around nervously in a high crime area. Those alone, the officer argued, were sufficient to justify the stop. And the Seventh Circuit found that they weren't. Finally, in another recent case from just June 5th of 2019, the question was posed, is running from the police enough for a reasonable suspicion to detain? And this, I believe, could play out very interestingly in Texas. In U.S. versus Brown, the Ninth Circuit found that given the racial dynamics of our society, along with a simple desire not to interact with police, it may offer an innocent explanation of flight when every other fact posited by the government weighs so weakly in support of reasonable suspicion. They were particularly hesitant to allow flight to carry the day in authorizing a stop. You can also cite studies for racial profiling for reasonable suspicion. This was successfully done in Commonwealth versus Warren, and the court held that where the suspect is a black male stopped by the police on the streets of Boston, an analysis of flight as a factor in the reasonable suspicion calculus cannot be divorced from the findings in the recent Boston Police Department report documenting a pattern of racial profiling of black males in the city of Houston. You should very much be looking towards the Center for Policing, as well as, if you're in Central Texas, grassroots leadership reports that have demonstrated racial bias in policing and arrests. Finally, there's been a big question about whether or not you can justify stops when you're in a proximity or presence of a high crime area. But in Brown versus Texas, the court noting that an individual's presence in the area with high risk of narcotics was insufficient to allow a stop or frisk. Simply being in an area of high crime is not sufficient because it can easily serve as a proxy for race or ethnicity. Finally, I think I said finally earlier, but one more. I want to encourage you to challenge identifications in and out of court. We know a few things about cross-racial identifications. Identifications are suggestive if the suspect is of a different race than other members in a lineup. Photo array identifications are extremely suggestive if the suspect's photo in an array is the only one that matches the description of the perpetrator, and if certain features of the suspect stand out in his or her photograph in comparison to other youth in their photographs. But if a lineup contains members of the same race, that fact does not automatically mean that the lineup is not suggestive either. We want to introduce research showing that where the victim and the alleged perpetrator are different races, races. That a cross-racial identification is often suspect. Research shows that people are less able to recognize faces of a different race than their own due to a phenomenon known as own race bias. In a recent case, the Supreme Court of New Jersey held an instruction on the unreliability of cross-racial identification should be given whenever there is cross-racial identification in the issue. This case extended a rule established in State versus Cromedy that required cross-racial identification instruction only when an identification is a critical issue and an identification is uncorroborated by other evidence. You should be asking for a jury instruction on cross-racial identification, even in bench trials. Just remember when doing this work, that eyewitness testimony is the most common way of identifying criminal suspects. It's also the most common reason for wrongful convictions. Studies have shown that eyewitness identification are often unreliable. And you should call upon experts who can talk about own race bias whenever it is present in your case. You can educate your judge about the inherent problems of cross-racial identification by filing a motion to appoint an expert that incorporates a summary of the research and the expert's proffered testimony regarding the scientific evidence of misidentification and cross-racial identification. Even if the judge does not grant the motion will educate the judge and potentially influence his or her rulings on the motion to suppress the identification. Finally, you should look at race-based defenses at trial. You should look at racial bias to falsely accuse. I think the clearest example of this is what happened recently in Central Park, where a woman was chastised by a runner for having her dog off leash and made a false accusation that was recorded. This evidence alone could be utilized in trial to determine whether or not you should raise and challenge a false accusation. You could challenge again the cross-racial misidentification by all witnesses, and you could look importantly at the unreasonable interpretation of threats. This unreasonable interpretation of threats is at the heart of the conversation that is existing all over the country at this moment. We are asking whether officers, but certainly whether individuals, can simply assume someone is a threat because of their race. I hope that defenders, after seeing this training, will begin to challenge those assumptions, will no longer allow witnesses to claim fear or animosity or threats simply because someone's race caused them to be in fear. Ultimately, what we will ask of you is to be bold, because if defenders don't have the courage to bring up race, who will? I consider us to be frontline workers in the new challenge to end systemic racism and to address racial injustice and adultification bias for our clients. It is our obligation. It is in fact required by our defender standards to raise the most aggressive, accurate, and timely defense. So I hope that you'll join me in beginning to utilize the tools that will be provided to you in an email following this, that you will reach out to the Lone Star Justice Alliance, to Mimi, to Dr. Butler, to Angel, should you need additional resources to make your challenges effective. We are here to support you, and we want to make sure that we can actually stop this practice, because our children and our clients deserve it. And I see that many people, now that I've exited the screen, have been asking if I'll share all of the case law. Yes, you will be receiving actually after this message, after the training, all attendees will receive a few items. You'll receive the annotated bibliography that I've referred to multiple times. You'll receive sample motions that you can utilize in your practice. You'll receive the checklist of items that I told you should consider as you move forward in determining how to raise race. And you'll receive a case law list that you can utilize for future practice. So we want to make sure that you leave this training with concrete tools that you can begin using on Monday.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So again, attendees, for our very last poll of the entire group, if this workshop has been beneficial to you, we just want to again take one more last poll inside of the chat, a yes, no, or hopefully we'll see yeses. If you do want to chat your comments about what you've learned, what you've taken away, feel free to do that too in this chat box. Believe me, we look at every single comment. Every single comment will be looked at, digested, and and try to understand so that we can deliver this content over and over and over again at different levels, right? I mean, the system works together, and so we all have to be educated. We all have to be, we all have to unlearn new, information, and this is the right time to do so. As our country, as our world grapples again with the, just the reckoning of what's happening, it's our time to be change agents and to really work on this work together as one. I want to thank Elizabeth. I want to thank Cameron. I want to thank Angel, and I know that Dr. Ebony has hopped off now, but I want to thank Dr. Ebony for spending everyone's time together so that we can offer this free innovative training to all of these people. And it just, again, we said that we were only going to provide this training to 50 defenders. 50, that was it. That was our bar. But we saw the extensive outpouring of need for this conversation. And so in closing, I just again want to reiterate that we are going to continue this work together. Want to make sure that I open it up real quick to Cameron and Elizabeth. Do you guys have any final words that you'd like to share?
I think the only other thing is please complete the survey that we're going to send at the end of this program as well. This is the first time we've hosted this. Again, I want to thank the Juvenile Training Immersion Program from the National Juvenile Defender Center who helped us prepare the training. But it's the first time we've done it. So I appreciate everyone for their patience as my technological and savvy was put to the test. But we really appreciate your concrete feedback. I hope that we will have an opportunity to continue this training. I also want to let you know that my incredible colleague, Ulysses Reeves Waters, who is a former city prosecutor in Dallas, will be hosting a similar training for prosecutors in the coming week. So if you liked this training, you'll find the next one even better. Please start letting your colleagues who are prosecutors know that it will be their turn to show up and to learn more about racial inequity and adultification bias. So please let them know that it's coming. Refer them to Measure's website and the Lone Star Justice Alliance so that they can start to receive the same information that you had, so we can all start to be on the same page.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Cam?
Yeah, when we walk into our courtrooms or even the beginning introduction to the juvenile justice system, the first thing that we see is race and gender, but it's the last thing that we talk about. And so I am so grateful that you all have given us an opportunity to share this information with you because we need to address it because it does matter. I threw out a lot of numbers and we talked about it, but when we started looking at the numbers, just started looking at the impact and what happens. When we are dealing with children, we want you to continue to remember that. And so, hey, as Elizabeth said, as defenders, if we don't do it, then it won't get done. And so we have an obligation and a duty to do it. So I encourage you all to be considerate of it and talk to our clients and, and look at what probation departments are doing, look at what the courts are doing, look at what the police are doing, and seeing does that have a negative impact on our children. So again, I want to thank you. I'm going to put up, if I can share my screen real quick, I'm going to put up the CLE information for that because let's see if I can get that real quick. So we can have that. and go from there. But again, thank you for letting us be a part of you. And, you know, I want to thank, you know, to Mimi, you know, and Elizabeth for, you know, thanks for having me present. And we look forward to our continued work together.
Absolutely. And again, this information is going to be, while it's flashing right now on the screen, we're going to make sure that we send a follow-up to you all, and we'll make sure that you have this CLE information. And again, for those that are working with Cameron at the Travis County Juvenile Defender's Office, the Travis County Girl Squad is kicking off. You will soon, yes, forever. And so you will soon receive an application for your clients if they are interested. Again, we only have 10 spots available for girls to be in our first cohort for the Travis County Girl Squad. But again, we are going to understand it, we'll research it, and hopefully we'll have a really cool curriculum that can be scaled up and, you know, and used at different locations all across Texas. Hell, all across America. So let's get this work done, y'all. Do well, breathe, as my friend Fatima Mann would say of Community Advocacy Healing Project. Make sure you stay hydrated and drink water. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you, everyone.